Do you know who would have loved this day? Walter. What a day it is. Mr. President and Mr. President, members of the CBS family, members of Walter's family. The other day, Walter's grandson, who is a proud member of the CBS Washington Bureau now, working this summer as an intern, came into my office and he asked me, what was it like when my grandfather was here? And I tried to tell him. And the first thing I told him was, it was fun. We all wanted to be there. His grandfather's enthusiasm captured us all. Walter Cronkite was the most curious man I have ever met. He always wanted to know everything about everything, and he wanted to know it before everyone else knew it. And that was the spirit that settled onto the Washington Bureau and to CBS News. There was a downside to this. Many of these questions that Walter would ask, and he would ask the questions, that's why he was such a great editor. He could always come up with these questions that nobody else would think to ask. Unfortunately, as Sandy Sokolow and John Lane and some of the people who were around the rim in those days with Walter would tell you, he always managed to ask these questions about 6:20, about 10 minutes before the news was ready to go on the air, and we were all trying to get our pieces together, and then we get one of these questions. We came to call them WWs, Walter wants to know. Between 6:10 and 6:30, here are some of the questions that Walter actually asked. How much oil is there in the world? In Poland, did they call him Father Christmas or Santa Claus? And then my all-time personal favorite, how long is Greenland? You ever think about that? Must admit, I never had. Walter used to call us around when we were on the beach, and one day he called me and he asked a question for the first time since I'd been at CBS I could actually answer. And I gave him the answer, and then he said, well, thank you, Bob. This old gray head just had a question mark above it. He really talked that way. I tell you that because Walter Cronkite off camera was exactly like Walter Cronkite on camera. How many times have we seen people on television or we've seen them in the movies and we thought they were one way and they turned out to be another way? Not Walter. Walter was exactly the way we all saw him on television. As someone said, Walter Cronkite was the way we wanted him to be. He loved news. He loved journalism. He loved to talk about it. And that was the infectious part. That is what set the spirit for CBS News. I never saw Walter Cronkite be rude to a stranger. And it was not just courtesy. Walter liked to talk about the news, and if somebody came up to him and wanted to talk about it with him, he wanted to talk to them. But if there was one thing he liked more than talking about the news to just someone who would approach him, it was talking about the news over a drink. He loved to get together with his friends and talk about the tall tales of journalism. I shall never forget one night at a book party here in New York, and I was standing over in a group, and I was talking to Peter Jennings and Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw, and we were having a big time, and I thought it would be a great picture if I could get Walter over there with all of them, all of the anchors of the day, and get their picture together. So I sought Walter out, and I found him, and I said, Walter, would you come over here and get a picture with all these guys? And he looked at me, and he said, could you tell them to come over here? I'm trying to get a drink, and I don't want to lose my place at the bar. He really said that. If Walter loved anything more than talking about the news, it was getting a news scoop, especially if it was his scoop. I will never forget, in 1976, there were two big stories that year. There was the presidential campaign, President Ford against Jimmy Carter, and there was this new flu vaccine. and it was making so many people sick that we began to wonder, are these government officials who are telling us all to take this stuff going to take it themselves? And it was people who were asking it on street corners, what about this stuff? Well, in the middle of all this and in the middle of the campaign, President Ford came up here to New York one day. They made up some excuse for why he was coming, but the real reason he was coming up here was to be interviewed by Barbara Walters, who was at that time the host of the Today Show, and in Walters' mind, his most formidable competitor, a view that I shared at the time. Well, Barbara interviewed President Ford, and then apparently she put out the word to the White House staff that if any of them allowed anyone to interview President Ford before her interview aired the next morning on the Today Show, that person would be killed. Apparently, I mean, that's what they told me, Barbara. But being reporters, we all set about to try to figure out some way to bust Barbara's scoop. So I went to the press secretary, who just sneered and said, of course not. We've given our word to Barbara Walters. And then the worst thing that could possibly happen happened. I get a call from Walter Cronkite, and I got to be the one to explain to him that Barbara Walters was about to do an exclusive interview with him. And he then said to me, well, I understand that President Ford is going to be up at Yonkers a little later today. Do you think there's any way I could come up there and watch him on the campaign trail? Well, what was I going to say? No, Walter, we've got it all in hand. You stay right back there in New York. We'll be fine. I'll call you and tell you. Of course I didn't say that. I said, well, of course, Walter, be delighted. And then, of course, I knew what was coming next. And, Bob, do you think there's any way you could get me an interview with the president? I said, well, I don't know, Walter. This is going to be tough, but I'll get right on it. So I went back to the press secretary, who this time just laughed and said, are you nuts? And then I couldn't think of anything else to do. So I went to the president's 32-year-old chief of staff. I called him Dick in those days. I would later call him Mr. Vice President, Dick Cheney. And I said, Dick, I'm in a real bind up here. I said, Walter Cronkite's coming out, and he wants to interview the president. He said, Bob, there's absolutely no chance whatsoever. We have given our word to Barbara Walters. No interview until that interview with the president appears on the Today Show. And I said, well, Dick, do you think that could you just get Walter in to say hello to the president? I said, I know the president likes him, and I know that, that he'd get a kick out of seeing Walter. And he said, well, yeah, I can do that. I said, well, we'll squeeze him in. And I said, Dick, do you think there's any possibility we could get a camera crew in there with him? I said, just a little souvenir for Walter. And he said, Bob, I have told you we are not going to authorize an interview. Now, no is no. And I said, but just the camera crew in there, just to take it. He said, well, all right. He said, I will let you do that. But he said, I'm telling you, I'm not authorizing any interview. So at the appointed time, we showed up at the back door, and they sneaked the camera crew and Walter in there. Walter took a microphone in his left hand. He walked up to the president with his right hand, shook hands, and said, hello, Mr. President, are you going to take your flu shot? Well, President Ford just sort of stifled a laugh, and he said, yes, Walter, I am. He said, I really think it's up to those of us in government to set a good example. I am going to take a flu shot. Well, by this time, the White House staff was trying to wrestle the crew to the ground. We were hustled out of there. President Ford just laughed. We got out of there. But that night, the CBS Evening News began with these words, good evening, President Ford told me in an exclusive interview on the campaign trail tonight. That he would take his flu shot, and then we actually ran that interview all 9 seconds of it. My friends, Walter Cronkite loved the news, and we loved Walter Cronkite for it. What a man.